Welcome to Thailand, Stefan, and welcome to TDRI. I hope you enjoy your stay here. And welcome everybody to TDRI's research seminar series. Today I have an honor to introduce today's presenter, Professor Stefan Collignon. Professor Stefan, just a little bit about his biography. Professor Stefan is currently a professor of political economy at St. Anna's School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, Italy, since October 2007. He also wears his other role as an international chief economist of the Central Europa Research, or CER. Previously, Professor Stefan was a Centennial Professor of European Political Economy at the London School of Economics and Political Science from 2001 to 2005. Then on 2005 to 2007, he was a visiting professor at Harvard University at the government department there. He is also an author of numerous books and articles on monetary economics and political economy of regional integration, which some of them you'll be able to download from his personal website at worldwideweb.stefancollignon.de. Today's talk is entitled "The Euro Crisis and the Future of the Euro." Please join me in welcome Stefan to TDI. Thank you.
So thank you very much for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to talk here to you about the Euro crisis. I'm very keen to also get some feedback from you, to hear what you think about what is going on in Europe and how it affects you. I think that is something that would be important for us to understand in Europe well, that we are not just our own, but the rest of the world is affected by what is going on. But what I thought to do is give you a presentation of the different causes and maybe also some of the remedies that have been tried, and so we have some foundation on which we can then further discuss the issues. Now, when we look at what's going on in Europe at the moment, it looks like after 60 years of ever closer union, which is what the Treaty of Lisbon says, maybe the European adventure has come to an end. This is what some newspapers, particularly in England or sometimes America, say. Maybe also financial markets seem to have priced that into some of the financial products. And it sometimes looks as if the euro could be on the brink of the implosion. On the other hand, it is remarkable that after 3 years of continuous pounding, of continuous crisis, challenges, the euro is still there, and the monetary union is still intact. That is a remarkable achievement, and it is due to the fact that it is a monetary union, meaning it's not a fixed exchange rate regime. We had previously a fixed exchange rate regime from 1979 to 1992, and when in 1992 the financial market started to speculate, it broke up within 4 months. This time we have survived already 3 years of crisis, and we are still existing. So that is, I think, remarkable. And the question is, in a way, why? Jean Monnet, who we consider as one of the founding fathers of European Union and integration, he once said, "Nothing can be done without the will of the man," meaning the leaders, the politicians, but nothing can last without institutions. And I think that is absolutely true what we have seen in this crisis. The political will of the present generation of political leaders, whether it is Merkel and before Sarkozy, or Hollande now, or Berlusconi or Monti or whatever, the political will of these people is weak. But the institutions have given solidity to the existence and persistence of monetary union, and that is what we have witnessed, and what I'm going to explain a little bit to you why that is so. Now, basically, we can say there are two explanations for this crisis. The fundamentalists, which have two subgroups, are either fiscal or macroeconomists. The fiscal fundamentalists say it is a crisis that was caused by public debt, lack of discipline, and excessive government deficits. And because governments have been borrowing excessively, they have accumulated unsustainable debt, and now this is what has reached us. The macroeconomists say, well, it's not just government debt, it's also private debt. So, for example, in Greece and in Portugal, there was excessive public debt, maybe also in Italy in the past. But in Spain or in Ireland, it was excessive private debt accumulated during the property boom. And this excessive borrowing has led to large current account imbalances, and it is these imbalances that are the root of the crisis. Now, the alternative model, which of course is not necessarily opposite, is the monetarist model that says this is a liquidity and banking crisis. The reason for it is that first there were shocks, the global financial crisis in 2008, and then the Greek confidence shock, and that has accumulated into a into a crisis of confidence in the financial markets. So I will discuss these three models of explanation a little bit further in detail with you now. First, is it a debt crisis? Well, first of all, look at these charts here. They show you GDP. And the straight red line is really the long-term trend for GDP levels. And what you see is that in all major economies of the world, when the Lehman crisis hit, it led to substantial shock or negative output in GDP, and none of these member states has ever returned to the previous trend GDP levels that prevailed before the crisis. Now, it is obvious that such a shock to output will have consequences for the public debt, and especially also the GDP debt GDP ratio. But here you see that in a way Europe is not terribly bad in terms of public debt. You see that since the mid-1990s, if anything, the debt ratio has slightly fallen in Europe. And then it has picked up after the Lehman crisis. In the US, that pickup has been much bigger, but compare this with Japan, which has much, much higher debt ratios and no financial crisis at this time, at least. Now, here you see charts for some of the individual member states of the euro area. The first panel there up there is the euro area of the 12 initial member states, and you see the same picture. Tendency to fall until the financial crisis hit, and then it shoots up dramatically. But if you look the second row, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, all under special regime now, they increase. I mean, in Ireland, as in Spain, which is the lowest, the third lowest there, the debt ratio had fallen significantly. And then the crisis came, and then that's where they shot up. In Greece, it was stable and then shot up. The two countries that really stick out as countries that did not respect the fiscal discipline are Germany and France. But they are not the countries in crisis today, strangely. So what does that show us? It shows us that the argument that this is a debt crisis caused by fiscal profligacy and irresponsible borrowing by governments is not really a good explanation. You see this more clearly here when you look at Greece as one dramatic example. The top panel there shows the red top line is government spending in absolute amounts of euros. The blue line underneath is government revenue. And the green line below is the difference, the deficit. And what do you find is that in Greece, spending has increased at a fairly steady trend. Yes, it has structurally been below revenue, so there's been a structural deficit, which is not really what they should have done following the treaty obligation under the so-called Stability and Growth Pact. But nevertheless, it was a stable structural deficit that, given that GDP, which is the middle panel, has increased quite substantially during this time, was not an enormous problem. In fact, it was a fairly steady ratio and financeable, sustainable, I believe. The problems start the moment GDP drops with the Lehman crisis. And you see what is the consequence on the top panel, that revenue, the blue line, is starting to fall, while expenditure continues to grow for another year or a year and a half. And again, this is not terribly irresponsible, because you would say in a crisis like that, the government should spend money to compensate for the loss of output there. Then came the second shock, and this is when it all turned sour, which was a new government was elected. They walk into office and say, oh my God, we discover there is much more borrowing, much higher debt than the previous government has admitted. They were lying, cheating, and not following the rules. And with that stability, with that confidence shock, financial markets got worried. And then the European authorities and other member states also got worried, and they said, okay, terrible, you need to now consolidate. So they start to consolidate. You see how the red top line is starting to fall, and they cut back. But of course, that reinforces the economic negative growth, as you see at the bottom line. So in a way, Greece at that moment was pushed into a negative feedback loop, a negative vicious spiral, whereby fiscal consolidation made growth worse, and that made output reductions worse, and that led to less revenue, and then they had to consolidate more. And this has been the policy with Greece ever since, for the last 3 years, with quite dramatic consequences, as you can see here. As in the previous decade or so, GDP grew on average 3%. In the 3 years since the Greek government changed, output has fallen by 10%, even more by now. I think they're down by 20 now. You see that it's private consumption, it's investment. I mean, equipment investment down by 50%. Domestic demand by nearly 20%. It's no wonder that this economy doesn't go anywhere. So that is, I think, an important part of the mistakes that this very German approach of saying it's all fiscal policy irresponsibility and the consequences it's had for policy remedies have caused tensions and reinforced the crisis. What about the second explanation, that it is macroeconomic imbalances? Well, during the first decade of European monetary union, European authorities have treated current account imbalances of member states in the euro area with benign neglect. They thought that it didn't matter. In fact, the Maastricht Treaty didn't ask for anything like this. And the reason was nicely formulated by Ingram already in 1973, who said intra-community payments become analogous to inter-regional payments within a single currency. In other words, a monetary union is a payment union, and it's not a fixed exchange rate regime. And I think this is a big analytical mistake that is often made by people not understanding how a monetary union works. They think it is like a fixed exchange rate regime, and so Greece could leave and then they could come back, and you read a lot of this nonsense from American economists who are taking international textbook off the shelf, and then they think, oh, Greece is a country, Germany is a country, it must be international economics we're talking about. It's wrong. It's just wrong, plain wrong. These people are too lazy to think for 1 second, how does a monetary union work? And the ECB and others, Blanchard, Giavazzi, looked at these rising current account deficits in Greece, Portugal, and other countries in the early years of the Union, and they said they're exactly what theory suggests can and should happen when countries become more closely linked in goods and financial markets. And they were right, because what should have happened is single market, one currency, efficient allocation of resources according to comparative advantages. So if Germany has good quality cars, why shouldn't everyone buy German cars? And that's what happened. So Germany has current account surpluses, and Portugal has a huge current account deficit. Now, since the beginning of monetary union now, and since the crisis, we have a new revisionist literature, which the Commission has adapted to, and they say that the southern countries exceed acceptable norms. What that is, God knows, but some economists argue that even in a currency union, these current account matter because persistent trade deficits in the south feed the accumulation of foreign debt, and this process is unsustainable and will eventually lead to exploding foreign debt levels. Sounds convincing, except it's also intellectually wrong, because it's not foreign debt. If Greece borrows in euros, it borrows domestic debt. It doesn't borrow foreign debt. So if you use policies to rebalance the current account as such, well, then you're going to harm the economy more. Here you see the current account positions of the euro area member states. The first panel shows the euro area as a whole. And if I may say that, what is interesting is in the middle here you have a nearly balanced current account position for the euro area as a whole with the rest of the world. This is the surplus of the north, particularly Germany, and this is the deficit of the south. So quite interestingly, yes, there is a mirror image between north and south. If you look at the individual countries, you see the German position up there, huge surpluses, and deficits down here in the south nearly everywhere, deteriorating positions and so on. But if you say that needs to be remedied, well, if you take a simple national accounts equation, meaning incomes, consumption, investment, government, and net exports, and you look at the identities you reformulated, you see that the current account or trade balance position depends on government deficits and the savings investment balance. If you want to reduce the current account, you either have to reduce the budget deficits, which is what the fiscal fundamentalists say, or you say reduce investment and increase savings. Now, if you do that, you're of course further reducing demand in countries that are already having problems with demand. And so, as a consequence, these policies make the crisis worse. Now, it is a smart question to say, what has caused the current accounts? Is it competitiveness? Is it excessive borrowing? And are these reasonable concepts, actually? Well, if you look at competitiveness and the cost developments, this is a chart one often sees. It shows unit labor costs and relative to the inflation target of the European Central Bank, which is the straight red line in the middle. The thick blue line is the average of the euro area. And you see that the euro area over time has pretty much remained below the inflation target of the ECB. So in that sense, for the average euro area, the cost has not been inflationary in any way, which of course we also see when we look at the performance of inflation over the last 15 years. But what is also significant in a chart like this is that in the north, say the yellow is Spain, the green one on the top is Ireland, unit labor costs have increased much more, and Germany, the lowest one here, they have stagnated. That has, in fact, of course, increased price gaps and so on. This chart is not entirely significant for one reason, that we don't know where's the level in the year 2000 when the index starts. So that would lead to a whole other discussion that I have worked on as well, but I won't repeat here now. But nevertheless, the chart shows you that divergences in unit labor cost, meaning wages relative to productivity, are a factor in relative competitiveness that can contribute to imbalances. But the question is, in a monetary union, the current account between the countries or regions does not really matter as long as it is financed. How is it financed? And there, a much better analytical tool than current account would be the flow of funds. Flow of funds is a statement that is also recorded, published by the ECB for the euro area as a whole, and you see it here. Basically, the idea is that theory tells us that in a normal textbook economy, households are saving, companies are borrowing to invest, the external part should be balanced, and the government should be balanced too. What we see for the euro area as a whole is households have been saving, companies have been borrowing, a bit more in the boom, a bit less in the slow growth period after dot-com crisis, and after the crisis they have started to pay back debt, deleverage, and in fact then companies even started to save themselves. And the mirror image of that is the government, total of the euro, all governments of the euro area have been borrowing, consolidating in the boom, which is good, and then in the crisis they have started to borrow significantly as well. The external rest of the world is fairly balanced. So in other words, we can really talk about the euro area as if it is a closed economy in the sense that external relationships are balanced. However, the story becomes really interesting when we look at the separation between North and South. Here we see the main northern and southern countries. Start with the South. Households have been borrowing, and then in the boom they started to borrow. Why? Because they bought houses. So the housing boom, financed on credit. The corporations have been borrowing and until the crisis came, and then of course they needed to restructure. And the governments actually did behave rather well and even consolidated until the crisis came in the South. In the North we have a very different and strange picture, because here, yes, households have been saving as they should, very nicely, but look at the corporate sector. After the euro starts, the corporate sector in the North instead of borrowing, becomes a net lender. So they are lending instead of borrowing and investing in the North. So no wonder most of this time German economy was stagnating. And in fact, what really has been happening here is that the northern countries in aggregate, corporations there, have been lending to the south where they had their clients who bought the goods from the north. Now, of course, that is in a way sustainable in the sense that within the monetary union, given that it's a closed system, the money gets recycled as it should be. But it is also creating regional imbalances between, in terms of employment, economic growth, and so on. So we had a boom in the south, which was financed by the savings in the north. And on that, you may argue it might be reasonable to have tools to maybe manage this a little bit better than we have had. But what it also says is that the boom in the south has as much been caused by the north as by the south. You cannot say they were irresponsible and the north and the Germans were virtuous. No, the Germans' behavior of cutting wages and not having spending in Germany meant that they could save the money that they would then fuel there. And so the two are really totally interdependent. So the conclusion from that is really that it is absolutely important to understand that a monetary union is not a fixed exchange rate regime. In fact, you can say the distinction is that a fixed exchange rate regime has foreign exchange reserves as the hard budget constraint. Meaning, if you run out of foreign exchange reserves, as you perfectly well know in Thailand, you're in trouble and your exchange rate collapses, which is why the old fixed exchange rate regime collapsed in Europe in 1992. But in a monetary union, it's a domestic economy where the banking system recycles the money, and the budget constraint is the monetary base generated by the central bank, monetary policy. And that's, I mean, logically, these are two totally distinct categories, because the external budget constraint is on the asset side of the central bank, and money, the domestic budget constraint, is on the liability side. So mixing the two up would be a logical error. So that leads us to the third analysis of the banking of the crisis as a liquidity and banking crisis. Here, the argument is that it is a vicious circle that starts out with a small local liquidity shock that causes a sudden deterioration in a specific class of asset values. I mean, this is particularly what happened with the Lehman crisis. But then that spills over to banks that need liquidity, and because the banks get distressed when the deteriorating asset prices put the balance sheet into difficulty, the assets are reduced, the liabilities remain the same, the share capital is reduced, then the banks need to increase their ratio of capital to assets, and that means they start to deleverage. It causes a credit crunch, and at that moment it spills over into the real economy, and you have a recession, which then further deteriorates asset prices all over the economy, and it goes on until you have a very severe depression. Now, in this context, government bonds play a key role in the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. And it's important to understand this link between the banks and the government debt, which is not the same as saying it was excessive borrowing by governments. This is in the secondary market and the influence that that has. The reason is that government bonds have an important role in the financing condition of the banking system. When fears of adverse development in the bond market spreads over into the financial markets, then it creates negative expectations. The banks may then want to sell these bonds more quickly, and that leads to herding effects. Everyone gets, it's an anti-bubble, so to say. They try to get out as quickly as possible, so everyone is selling more and then otherwise, and the prices deteriorate more. So in that sense, the shock is transmitted by the fact that banks have an important part of government bonds in their portfolio. In addition to that, as the yields go up, this influences banks when they are setting remuneration on deposits or on the return on bonds issued in the primary market, on the lending rates in banks, and so on. And so it contributes to the funding costs of banks, and therefore it affects the economy as a whole, at least regionally. It means then also for the banks that need liquidity from the central bank, they need to give some assets as collateral, which are usually or often, not exclusively, but often government bonds. But if the prices have collapsed, then again it means their collateral is constrained. And these tensions in sovereign debt market will contribute to a freezing in the interbank market because the banks don't trust each other anymore. So you don't know if the other one is having a big problem holding a lot of Greek debt or not, and so they don't lend to each other. And the consequence then is that the central bank has to step in. So in fact, what we have seen is, as the market dried up, the ECB became the principal lender, the lender of last resort to the banking system as a whole. And that was an enormous charge, but at the same time, it was the guarantor of the robustness of the system. When I said earlier the European monetary system of fixed exchange rates collapsed within 4 months of financial market attacks, speculative attacks, it is because banks ran out and central banks ran out of foreign exchange reserves. Here, it's a different story. By nature, as a central bank, the ECB lends to the banks and is the lender of last resort. So if the banks have excess liquidity, they deposit it with the ECB. If they need extra liquidity, they borrow it and they get it from the ECB. And banking history of the last 300 years has taught us that this is what a central bank has to do: give liquidity to the banking market, otherwise the whole system collapses. So this is what the ECB did, and that is the institutional robustness that has helped the euro to survive the last 3 years. But of course, it has a spillover into the real economy, which is the credit crunch, and leads to a reduction. Now here you see on the left side, you see the yields, how they shot up for Greece up to 25%, and for some other southern member states significantly, while for Germany, the safe haven, the yields actually started to come down. And the combination of that is, if you look at the relative value of Greek government bonds relative to German government bonds, you see that during most of the euro area, first decade, they were stable in terms of their value relationship. But with the crisis, they deteriorated significantly to a level where they are only 20%. The Greek bonds are worth only 20% of German bonds. So it is a measure of the shock that the Greek economy has suffered in this crisis. And that shows also up when you look at credit default swaps, which went up everywhere. And of course, what is interesting is, like, if you look, Greece 2,000 points up, but in Japan, the crisis also created a little bit of uncertainty, but only 200 points, despite the fact that Japan has twice as much debt as, say, Italy, or 3 times or 4 times as much as some other European member states. So that is all a measure of the shock. But what is ultimately behind this, the danger of such a financial crisis, is that it affects the whole banking system within the monetary union. You see here balance sheet exposure of banks in the different member states to some of the southern member states. So, for example, Germany exposure, German banks' exposure to Greek debt is about 7%, which is not too high. But if you look at Portugal, it's 18%. So if then there's a problem with the debt in Greece, it affects Portuguese banks. So the crisis spilled over from Greece to Portugal. Then you look at exposure to Spain. Germany, 35%. The Netherlands, 57%. So they are clearly affected by Spain. But Spain is, where's Spain? Spain is strongly affected by Portugal. Portugal has been affected by Greece. So the chain goes from Greece, Portugal, Spain, and then the danger is it may collapse France, Germany, the Netherlands, which is the strength of the financial system. Now all that comes, these are percentages in terms of their own share capital. And this comes after substantial write-offs have already been made after the Lehman crisis. So that is a financial fragility in the banking system. And of course, the ECB, by giving liquidity to banks and so on in extraordinary ways and measures, has tried to prevent a bailout, collapse of the banking system there. Now, the question, of course, you may ask is, why is this concentration of domestic debt in the banks, the so-called home bias, which is an important part of the fragility of the banking system? Now we're talking about a banking union in Europe, and the banking union hopefully will create conditions to overcome some of this home bias. But the home bias means that, or is caused by the fact that often local banks have bought bonds issued by their government and then held it in portfolio. Maybe they couldn't sell it, or they thought it was beneficial, or the governments wanted them to do so. And so what has happened there is that there's been a regional financial market segmentation, and this segmentation has generated this home bias, which Obstfeld and Rogoff has called one of the 6 major puzzles of international macroeconomics. Of course, the standard theory tells us it's about market imperfections, culture, asymmetric information, and so on. But in reality, these are some data. I won't go too much in the details. I think some of you have the printout. You can study it. It shows that there is, for some countries, a significantly higher exposure to government debt than in others. So the negative spillover from this sovereign debt crisis into the real economy was further accelerated by the famous no bailout principle. You see, what we have seen here before, when we look at the yields, is during most of the first decade of monetary union, the yields were pretty much the same for all member states. Why have they all shot up after the Lehman crisis? And the answer is, whoops, this was wrong. And the answer is that this was generated by the no bailout clause, which in the treaty says the union shall not be liable or assume the commitments of central governments, regional, local, or other public authorities of any member state. Now, this principle assumed that financial markets would survey government debt and punish excessive borrowing by raising interest rates and thereby ensure fiscal deficit. This was the theory when the Treaty of Maastricht was made. It was supposed to be a market mechanism to discipline governments. Well, it hasn't worked. And I think it hasn't worked because it's wrong theory. Because what this principle assumes is that, or neglects rather, is this negative impact on the balance sheet of banks. Because if you think that the yields should go up, it means a deterioration in the value of assets. And then it affects, with home buyers, it affects these balance sheets of banks negatively. So the banks cannot discipline the government, or if they do it, then they risk explosion in the banking system. So this so-called no bailout principle, I think, is really bankrupt. This view was excessively naive, and not only because markets were short-sighted before the crisis, but much more serious is that they didn't understand the nexus between the credit risk of banks and sovereigns that is caused by the home buyers. And if markets would punish these excessive borrowers, ultimately they would punish themselves. So that means, of course, that local banks will suffer disproportionately from the deteriorating of local economic conditions. So if, as we have seen before, in the case of Greece, there's a negative spiral, then that means output loss, means additional credit risk for banks, non-performing loans. That makes it even worse, write-offs for the banks. The whole thing becomes even worse. And at that point, the whole system becomes extremely fragile, and something else has to happen. Somebody has to bail out the government bonds. Somebody has to buy the government bonds that investors in the are selling on the secondary market. And the dynamics of the euro crisis, therefore, as I see it, was first global financial crisis reduced asset values. Then the Greek confidence shock affected the Greek bonds. German chauvinism resisted the bailout with the argument, we don't want to pay for the Greeks because already we're paying enough tax for ourselves. But with that, they didn't understand that this kind of German resistance to bailout was creating externalities that were detrimental to everyone, including Germans. But at that point, the crisis then spilled over into the real economy. Other countries were then affected that had nothing to do with it. And Europe's way of dealing with this through intergovernmental negotiation caused gridlock in political decisions. And at that point, the whole logic got worse and worse. You see the consequences also if you look at the external value of the euro. You see that, okay, initial years, it took a time until the euro had some credibility. Then it was strong for nearly 8 years. And with the crisis, it started to have a downward trend. Maybe we see now also that since the summer of this year, 2012, that is starting to shift. There are few first indicators, including the fact that maybe in this summer that the deterioration of the euro-dollar exchange rate was less strong than in earlier phases of the crisis. But in any case, the financial markets are reflecting the political chaos, the political resistance, and so on. And I've done one paper, which is also on my website, where I've looked at the economic consequences of Mrs. Merkel, as I call it, which is a gauge model that measures the impact of statements made by the German Chancellor on the Greek government yields or spreads relative to Germany. And what we find is that the yields have gone up continuously with rising uncertainty. But if we put in the variable of the statements of Mrs. Merkel, you see at the lower image here, the lower graph, that the uncertainty is increased enormously. And to put it in a nutshell, we have estimated that every time Mrs. Merkel has spoken about Greek and the Greek crisis, the financial market got into terror, the spread shot up. Then the others tried to pull it back. It reduced it a little bit, but the spread was up. And the cost of this uncertainty caused by Mrs. Merkel was roughly 1 billion euros every time she spoke, given that over the period that we have looked at, she spoke about 70 to 100 times. You can say that her cost is about 100 billion. Huh? Now, thank God, there are more people and more countries in the European Union and the Euro area than just Germany. So there was a little bit more of policy responses to that. After a while, they finally, in May 2010, understood that they needed to have a bailout. They created the European Financial Stability Fund, a bailout fund that bought Greek, Irish, and Portuguese bonds. In last year, this year, 2012, it was transformed into a permanent fund called European Stabilization Mechanism, ESM. But that was, in a way, not enough. And the econometric evidence that I have gathered shows that actually the impact of these funds and purchasing by these funds were rather weak. Interestingly, much more important was the central bank intervention as the lender of last resort to the banks and banking system. The ECB has responded to the crisis through a number of unorthodox measures. The first one was the covered bond purchasing program, which was, in a way, a response to asset price deflation after the Lehman crisis. And then in May 2010, together with the EFSF, they started the so-called securities market program, which was the first time that the ECB actually bought government bonds. Before that, they had never bought them outright. They had used them as collateral, but not as outright purchases. That was relatively limited, and then the impact of some of these measures decided by the end of last year were not sufficient. The financial market confidence deteriorated further in the summer. And at that point, the ECB got really worried and thought that from the yield curve observations, they saw that the markets were now counting in the risk of a breakup of the euro system. And there, ECB President Mario Monti stood out and up and was a true leader. He declared in a famous conference in London, the ECB will do whatever it takes to save the euro. Subsequently, this has been formalized by the so-called outright market transactions, which is a program under which the ECB is committed to buy unlimited amounts of government debt if these governments are asking for funding under the ESM, the stabilization mechanism. So in other words, there's a procedure under which the ECB is now willing to buy government debt, which before it didn't do. There's a big been a big debate whether they should intervene or not. The Bundesbank is highly critical of this, but they are totally isolated within the board of the ECB, so thank God they're not getting very far with that. But these measures, especially now the outright market transactions, are very courageous on the side of the ECB, but they have helped to stabilize the financial markets. And when I said we might also be seeing that in the foreign exchange rate to the dollar, it might well be that there is we finally reached the bottom of distrust that was in the market. Now, who should intervene? Should the central bank buy government bonds or not? It is a big debate in Europe, as I said, especially with respect to the ECB, with respect to the Bundesbank. But if we look at facts, it is there's rather weak evidence. The argument the Bundesbank makes is that it says, if you buy government debt, then, of course, it will ultimately lead to inflation. It's monetizing government debt, and that's always the beginning of inflation. Well, let's look at the balance sheet. ECB balance sheet, yes, it increased after the financial crisis, as it did in the US, as it did in the UK, and I guess everywhere in the world, because the central banks intervened in the crisis with high liquidity preference in the market. But if you look at government bond purchases by the ECB, it's this little red line here, which is a tiny amount. It is about 200 billion euros, which is less than 7% of the total ECB assets and 2.5% of GDP. Now, compare that to the Fed, where treasuries are nearly 60% of the Fed assets, and that is 10% of GDP, so 4 times higher than in the euro area. And go to England, the Bank of England, 90% of the Bank of England's assets are now so-called gilts, which are government bonds. 90%. Before they had nothing of that. So, I mean, in that sense, the Bank of England has enormously, much more monetized government debt, but nobody seems to be worried that pound sterling might disappear, or that the dollar might disappear, or that there will be hyperinflation in America. Why this obsession in Europe? It may have to do with German history and maybe German autism, I don't know. But in any case, the facts are not really supporting these kind of arguments. The best remedy to these kind of problems would really be issuing Eurobonds to have what the Americans have as an equivalent of treasury bonds, because the Eurobond would solve the home buyers issue, the home buyers problem. And then you would have a benchmark also in terms of lending to the rest of the credit markets and so on. So the European Commission has made proposals how some of these Eurobonds could be done, but the Germans block, basically because they don't want to be giving guarantees for anyone else that they can't control. And in fact, I think this is really the core problem that we are facing in Europe now. Who controls what? The Germans don't want to pay for others. The others don't want to be controlled by Germany. There is a lack of legitimacy in terms of fiscal and other economic policies in the interest of the European Union as a whole and the welfare of European citizens as a whole, which comes from the fact that there is no proper European government that has a democratic legitimacy. So there have been a number of important policy responses, institutionally, however. The so-called six-pack, the 6 European laws that strengthened fiscal surveillance, defining quantitatively what means a significant deviation from medium-term a stability pact orientation which needs to be corrected. Debt criteria are clearly formulated. So what should countries do to bring the debt ratios down when they're above 60%? There's the so-called reverse majority, which means in the future it is much more difficult for member states to go against the European Commission, because they must have a qualified majority, absolute, or qualified majority, even more than absolute majority, to abrogate a policy proposal by the European Commission instead of approving it. And so these are strong measures that bring fiscal policy under control, but this is really addressing issue number one that we discussed before, more the fiscal hawk interpretation of the crisis. Then there's a European semester, which means member states must coordinate their national budget plans in advance of bringing them to their parliaments. Then there's a fiscal compact whereby countries have agreed to accept the rules of the European Stability and Growth Pact into national law, sometimes with constitutional force. And the European Court of Justice may impose financial sanctions on these member states if they don't follow those rules. So again, this strengthens the fiscal procedure. On terms of the second interpretation of the crisis, macroeconomic imbalances, the European Commission has produced a new mechanism of surveillance with an alert system that uses scoreboards of indicators and then recommends in-depth country studies, and then they've set up a procedure to prevent excessive imbalances, very similar to the Stability and Growth Pact. It hasn't worked there terribly well. I have doubts that it will work that well here, but at least there's a procedure to talk about these things. However, I think ultimately what we're really facing, what is the real Achilles heel of European monetary union, is politics. This is the problem. And the problem is you have so-called sovereign member states who are not really sovereign anymore because they are dependent on each other. And in fact, at this moment, you can say there's only one country that imposes its policy on others, and that is Germany. And with that, it creates also tensions, it creates rejection, and it lacks legitimacy. You can send the troika of ECB, Commission, and IMF into these different states like Greece, Portugal, and so on, and say, do this, and this. And then the Greeks say, well, but we don't want to do it. And then we vote for another government, and then there's no majority for another government. And then what do? They say, well, vote again. And fine, they vote again. It worked out by miracle one more time. But it won't work forever. I mean, one day it will happen that people will say enough is enough. Now we want something really else. And then the whole system will really have a kind of breakdown. So I think the real issue in Europe today is a political issue. It's an issue of political legitimacy, and that means democracy. So what would need to happen is that you, let's say, transform the European Commission in some kind of European government and legitimize it through the European Parliament. And then people should have a choice at election day between political options. So in that sense, an alternative to policies which today are presented as being without alternative could actually happen. Then I think the political acceptance of some of these policies will become much higher. But whether that will happen or not is a matter of political will. And I think if this does not happen, then in the long run, the European experiment will actually fail. But there is also clearly the hope and the possibility that they will move in this direction, and debates are about this at this moment in Europe. Thank you very much.